Okay, what I'm going to present today is a draft of one chapter of a book project where I'm rather focused on the topic of mixing in racial theories. On the one hand, intra-racial mixing and interracial mixing. And I'm going to show you that Kant was opposed to interracial mixing, so any form of mixing of white race to other races. I will give you an overview about that. And he was pretty much in sympathy with intra-mixing within the white race. The second thing I'm going to show you today is that all this is rooted or entrenched in his metaphysics, or rational teleology. So rooted again in the third critique of power of judgments. So as you're already familiar with the debate, in the recent years there is so much discussion about Kant's racism or Kant's racializing beliefs. But the most you see in the literature or at a more popular level, there are a bunch of quotes. So you see hardly works that cast light on the real metaphysical reasons behind this racializing beliefs, if there were any. Okay, I think there are a lot of them. Okay, and today I'll try to shed light on some part of them in the context or in light of Kant's teleology. So let me ask so simple first. What is the role of the concept of race and what does it mean according to Kant? For your information, there are three important essays on the topic of race. You see that, the dates, everything. The first one is in the pre-critical period. The other two are in the critical period. Interestingly, the second one is in the same year where Kant published Groundwork. The third one is the same year in which he published the Critique of Practical Reason. And you see, he republished them, and all of them at once in 1797 and 1799. For your information, he stopped with lecturing at the university in 1796, which means he was pretty much concerned with the topic until the end of his career. Okay? So, just for the record. So the question again, what is now the role of the concept of race and what does it mean according to Kant? First off, Kant believes in monogenesis. That is, he assumes, in contrast, for example, to Voltaire, that all human beings belong to the one and the same species, that we are all from the same phylum, Stamm in German. So he is opposed to polygenism, he is monogenist. And again, for your information, polygenism is a double-edged doctrine. For some people, like for Voltaire or Georg Forster, it was kind of critique or criticism against the biblical version of the creation of human beings. But to some slaveholders, that was the ever best theory in order to justify slavery or the harshest forms of treatment of slaves, because the doctrine said we have local, different, incommensurable creations, so we European people or whatever are the other sort, and the other people have do not share the same creation. Okay, and then Kant assigns to the concept of race the role of making comprehensible the differences within the one and same species that he believes are unfailingly hereditary, unausbleiblich erblich. Here is one of the official definitions of the concept of race in Kant's essays in the second essay. Now Kant thinks that four skin colors, namely white, black, copper red, and olive yellow, show the unfailingly hereditary or radical peculiarity, as he says, of human beings, which he calls race. Moreover, he believes he can derive all hereditary ethnic characters from the four skin color-oriented races. Second question is, how does a race come into being? And Kant has a story here. The four principal skin colors are, he argues, the result of certain developmental processes. These processes represent an interaction that takes place between, on the one hand, certain internal factors in the nature of the human species in a hypothetical original form. He calls these internal factors germs and natural predispositions, Keime und natürliche Anlagen, and on the other hand, external environmental factors, especially the influences of air and sun. The hypothetical original human being preceding the four races must have potentially distinct for all climates and every soil, so different germs and natural predispositions must have lain ready in them. Germs and predispositions are thus potentialities in the original shape of human beings, waiting to be, I quote, either unfolded or restrained, unquote, by external environmental conditions. Interestingly and unsubstantiated, Kant presumes kind of zero-sum relationship between these chymes and external factors. Once one chyme or one germ is actualized, this happens at the cost of suffocating of the others. Okay? This is a unilateral process and happens just once, which means race is permanent. I'll return to this. Kant's conception of race contains, furthermore, another central idea. This is a key passage in the first essay, but this is a thesis he thoroughly advocates in all his lecturing and writings on race. Once a race is founded, it remains always the same, regardless of how the climate changes. I call this elsewhere the irreversibility thesis, and it's something which you see in all writings and lectures and notes, reflections of Kant. So just keep that in mind. Irreversibility thesis means races, once founded, are permanent. So you cannot change it. There is no racial entrance and no racial exit for the individuals. Especially in his third essay on race, on the use of the teleological principles in philosophy, Kant elaborates on a new aspect of racial development that sheds more light on the normative implications of his account. The racial development of some groups of human beings might pause if the interaction of their natural predispositions with their climate goes awry. He says sometimes through violent revolutions of nature or too early migrations. And that has the result that the actualization of their natural predispositions remains incomplete. Thus, this is one passage in the third essay, a race would have been founded which is not suited to any climate, since the southern adaptation prior to its departure was interrupted halfway through and exchanged against an adaptation to the northern climate. Kant takes some of the inhabitants of America, so Native Americans, to represent this racial underdevelopment, as their natural disposition, I quote, did not achieve a perfect suitability for any climate, unquote. And this, he proceeds, is the reason, I quote, it's disturbing, sorry, why this race, which is too weak for hard labor, too indifferent for industry, Emsichkeit, and incapable of any culture, ranks still far below even the N, I do not spell this out, who stands on the lowest of all the other steps that we have named as differences of other races. So you see, he has a racial hierarchy. At the lowest level is N, and he says those who are underdeveloped, there are still lower than that. So, okay? Which means racial actualization is a matter of degree, which, to be completed, needs time and favorable environmental conditions. A race development might be stuck in between. Predispositions become thereby dysfunctional, establishing a race in the broad sense of the word, which falls short of its purpose. Kant understands the racial underdevelopment to be the cause of a flaw in agency. I call this elsewhere the underdevelopment thesis, or racial underdevelopment. While Kant sees his theory of race of great use in the investigation of nature, his theory of race is not a description of natural phenomena. Rather, it is a retrospective reconstruction or part of what he calls natural history, Naturgeschichte. It uses teleological concepts which are based on the principle of the purposiveness of nature. Sorry, I will get back to this, which again is founded in our reason, with both a supplementary and inevitable role in the examination of nature, where, I quote, sources of theoretical cognition are not sufficient, unquote. In other words, our reason projects, so to speak, the concept of race onto the evolutionary history of the human species to make its subspecific, unfailingly hereditary differences comprehensible. Now let me a bit expand on this. Recall that the first or the initial teleological background is the following: nature's care for the preservation of the species. This is the first assumption, which means natural predispositions to all racial differences, I quote, must have lain necessarily in the germs of a single first phylum, so that the latter would be suitable for the gradual population of the different regions of the world, unquote. Now, what is Kant's teleology? What is the metaphysical theory behind all this story? As I said, Kant's theory of race is part of what he calls the natural history of the human species, which is not, quote, the cognition of natural things as they are now, unquote, but a reconstructive, quote, cognition of that which they once were and of the series of changes they underwent to arrive at each place in their present state, unquote. So it is a retrospective theory which, on grounds of principles of reason, reconstructs the developmental history of the species of human beings. At the beginning of his third essay on race, Kant clarifies still more carefully than in the precedent essays that his theory of race is a teleological account which refers only to such ends that can be known through experience. His claim is that there is, I quote, a warrant, Befugnis, indeed a need to start from teleological principle where theory, insofar as it is based on experience, abandons us, unquote. More importantly, Kant provides here in the third essay an illuminating characterization of race that marks his metaphysical position on race very, very clearly. He asks, what is race? And he says, the word does not figure in a system of a description of nature, therefore, presumably, the thing itself is nowhere in nature either. In other words, Kant is not a racial essentialist. This is highly important. I go on, yet the concept designated by this expression is well grounded in the reason of each observer of nature. The fact that this word does not occur in the description of nature cannot prevent the observer of nature from finding it necessary with respect to natural history, unquote. So again, Kant's account of race is teleological, but this is not the sort of teleology we encounter before him, positing certain ends in the nature, independent of human beings. The second part of his third critique, called Critique of the Teleological Power of Judgment, presents the final version of Kant's teleology of nature, which, although published after his race essays, provides the metaphysical foundation for his conception of race. I will be happy to discuss this in the pause if you have some chronological questions. So, as you know, the power of judgment in Kant's theory is an integral part of Kant's conception of reason in the broad sense. Reason in the broad sense means it is opposed to sensibility or the empirical. And in German, we would say obere Erkenntnisvermögen. Three times, there are so many details, I'm not going to go into this. And you know already that the power of judgments operates twofold. So in general, it is concerned with the relationship between the particular and universal. And if only the particular is given, and we are looking for the universal, Kant calls this the reflective power of judgment. I'm going to abbreviate this as RPJ, if it's okay. All right. Well, I think that it is RPJ which is at the heart of Kant's teleology, therefore his natural history. Okay, so in order to find out what is the metaphysical teleological theory behind his race theory, we have to focus on RPG. One of Kant's guiding questions in the third critique is whether the power of judgment has, like pure understanding and pure reason, a priori principles for itself. And as you know, his short answer, of course in need of multiple explanations, is yes. RPG has its own a priori transcendental regulative principle, namely the purposiveness of nature, by which alone we sensible, rational beings are able to comprehend the order of nature in accordance with empirical laws. But what is exactly this purposiveness of nature? or as Kant says, the purposiveness of nature in its multiplicity. It is the following: nature is represented through this principle, I quote, as if an understanding contained the ground of the unity of the manifold of these empirical laws. So for Kant, the purposiveness of nature is a special transcendental principle that has its origin strictly in RPJ. The power of judgment uses this principle to reflect on the relation of appearances in nature in light of their ends. For example, the end of the preservation of kinds. However, the principle of purposiveness is not a surrogate for mechanical causal laws of nature. This is important. The idea is that we, in addition to and complementary to seeking mechanical causal explanation, must reflect on natural phenomena and their relationship as if they had an internal purposiveness. The purposiveness of nature, therefore, strictly speaking, does not explain, erklären, nature. So it's not explanatory of nature. This is highly important again. Furthermore, the principle of purposiveness is not constitutive for nature. We do not, as Kant frames it, prescribe purposiveness to nature, but are only guided by it. It is a regulative principle. It does not say what happens, but rather how natural phenomena for subjects, meaning agents of cognition, I quote, ought to be judged, unquote. So there's a normativeness to this piece of theory. The subjectivity of the principle does not mean that its validity is not universally objective. Kant rather advocates a peculiar form of strict objectivism here. And this specific form of objectivism has its source in reason of all rational beings, not in the nature, even though it could only be led by empirical data. Well, this is very shortly the metaphysics behind Kant's conception of race. So as some Kant scholars would say, like Stella Sanford, the concept of race is emblematic for his principle of purposiveness of nature. It's an instantiation of that principle. And the story goes like this. Our reason, which in Kant's view is in search for order and unity in nature, needs to make the relation between commonalities and diversity among human beings comprehensible. Then it avails itself of teleological judgment, which guides its research into natural history. What operates here especially is RPJ as an integral part of our reason with its transcendental regulative principle of purposiveness at the highest level of objectivity. As Kant unambiguously clarifies in his final essay on race, race itself is nowhere in nature, yet the concept designated by this expression is well grounded in the reason. So in a word again, race is a product of reason projected onto nature. At the beginning of his second essay on the determination of the concept of race, and this is one of the few meta-theoretical essays Kant has written. It's about the determination of a concept. Kant writes, "It is of great consequence to have previously determined the concept that one wants to elucidate through observation before questioning experience about it. For one finds in experience what one needs only if one knows in advance what to look for." And indeed, this is what occurs in Kant's account. Just consider few disturbing examples. In the first essay on race, he writes that the dissolution of iron in the blood of the whites, as opposed to red, black, and yellow skin groups, attests that they carry the white race, the perfect mixture of the fluids in their bodies, and their strength ahead of others. The white race arose in an environment in which the most fortunate mixture of influences of the colder and hotter region and also the greatest riches in creature of the earth are found. In the second essay, he writes that since true N-race lives in regions in which the air is so phlogistized through the thick forest and swamp-covered regions, it was an arrangement very wisely made by nature to organize their skin such that the blood could dephlogistize itself much more strongly through the skin than is the case with us, i.e. white Europeans. This would be the reason for the strong odor of N, which cannot be helped through any cleanliness. For your information, phlogiston was at that time highly controversial and definitely falsified by ideas of Lavoisier. Okay? He knew that. In the third essay, in referring to the historian and geographer Matthias Sprengler, Kant writes that N and gypsies, who were for him Indians, lack an immediate drive to activity, especially to the sustained activity that one calls industry, which is especially interwoven with certain natural predispositions. They do not bring any more of this impetus into their climates and pass it on to their offspring than was needed for their preservation in their old motherland and had been received from nature. This inner predisposition extinguishes just as little as the externally visible one, which means skin color in the first line. The far lesser needs in those countries and the little effort it takes to procure only them demand no greater predispositions to activity, unquote. And in 1792, in physical geography, a lecturer who almost 50 times in his whole career repeated, in the torrid zones, humans mature more quickly in all aspects than in the temperate zones, but they fail to reach the same degree of perfection. Humanity has its highest degree of perfection in the white race. The yellow Indians have a somewhat lesser talent. The N are much lower, and the lowest of all is part of the American race. He repeats that in his review against Herder again in 1785. You see passages in 1785 and 1788 with the same thesis. Okay? This is what I call the underdevelopment thesis. Well, these were some facts. Okay, historical facts, some key passages. Let me move to the second part, race mixing, where I'm focused in, at least today. I mean, I'm not going to say much about the intra-racial diversity, just touch on it, and more talk about interracial mixing and why Kant was opposed to this. So, first of all, Kant regards his conceptual determination of race, I quote, proven and moreover useful as a principle of investigation in natural history, unquote. And he thinks the only reliable test, he calls it experiment, that shows the skin color oriented races are unfailingly hereditary is the observation of mixed races. It's pretty much circular, but he does that. So first, this is how he proceeds. Half-breeds carrying colors of both parents give us reason, I quote, strong conjecture that the parents are of different races. If, however, I quote, the product of their mixing is always half-breed, then the conjecture becomes certainty, Gewissheit, unquote. In other words, race stubbornly persists, and we see this in mixed races. The generation of half-breeds is not merely proof of monogenism, but also of the proper determination of the concept of race in terms of skin color. The unfailing heredity of color peculiarities from both parents is, I quote, the only true and at the same time sufficient touchstone for the difference of the races to which the parents belong and a proof of the unity of the phylum from which they originated, unquote, and this is from the second essay. So, race mixing provides the sole reliable test that races are unfailingly hereditary, therefore evidence that his determination of the concept of race is verified. And indeed, this is one of the main messages of his second essay in 1785. Sorry. Now it's common in the literature that Kant was opposed to race mixing, or as he says, die Halbschichtigen, interbreeding. And I know we'll focus on some reasons for this, which are entrenched, as I think, in his teleological rational theory of race. First of all, note that the one way, or maybe the only way, within Kant's framework to dilute or even completely dissolve racial differences is race mixing. Races could, on Kant's account, completely, he says, melt together, zusammenschmelzen, in mixed races after a number of generations, even if Kant says nature dislikes this. It is possible, though not desirable, that those whose ancestors went through multiple interbreeding cannot be assigned races, at least none of the four color-oriented main races Kant stipulates. In a key passage in the third essay on race, Kant writes the following. With respect to the varieties, this is a technical term in Kant's race theory, which means puts very simply intra-racial differences. For example, Kant has a broad conception of white races, Arabs, Italians, Germans, Spaniards, Persians. They are all varieties of white races. And mixing between them is desirable, according to Kant. It's a good thing for the civilization and for the diversity of character. So he is not opposed to white intra-racial mixing. So again, with respect to varieties, nature seems to prevent the melting together because it is contrary to its end, namely the manifoldness of the characters. By contrast, as regards the differences of the races, nature seems at least to permit the melting together, although not to favor it, since thereby the creature becomes fit for several climates but not suited to any of them to the degree achieved by the first adaptation to it, unquote. There are several important points to take from this short passage. Kant's account approves of diversity intraracially, but not interracially. Here's another passage from the Anthropology. It's important for his opinion on intraracial variety. I'll leave it to you if you want to read it to yourself. Just go farther due to time. So again, Kant's account approves of diversity intraracially, but not interracially. More importantly, his view of mixed races has a similarity with the racial underdevelopment thesis. Mixed races do not, just like underdeveloped races, fit into the teleological narrative that reason puts forward. Race mixing is contrary to nature's perfect purposiveness. Moreover, the passage might also suggest the transitivity of racial disadvantages of those who are racially low-rated to the next generation even after intermixing with high-rated races, thus reinforcing the superiority of an alleged better race by disapproving of its mixing with lower races. And here is a passage for you. This is a part of the preparatory work to the Streit der Fakultäten. It is from end of 1780s. You know that the conflict of faculties was published in 1798, so it's a gap there, but still it is from the end of 1780s. He's talking about the progress, and he writes the prospect of progress can be either that there will be better and better human beings by virtue of nature, or that human beings themselves will do it always better. With regard to the former progress, in which nature would develop new and better races or produce them by melting of two together, there is probably nothing to be hoped for, because nature has long since exhausted her forms appropriate to the soil and climate, and the generation of bastards, this is a unique word, e.g. of the Americans with the Europeans, or of these with the black race, has degraded the good race without proportionally raising the worst one. And there is this notorious reflection from the 1780s. This is reflection 1520, where in one passage he writes, "It is not good that they mix Spaniards in Mexico." And finally, since the only way to change a race is intergenerationally through race mixing, Kant's opposition to race mixing can be put in conjunction with the irreversibility thesis. Races are not only regarding the past and present irreversible, it is also undesirable to assimilate them in the future. In his first essay on race, Kant clearly wants nature to be left, he says, undisturbed, without foreign mixing, until races are developed. So his natural history wants races to be once for all established. And the third essay on race, he explicitly says that it is according to reason purposive that races remain separate. As Robert Bernasconi observes, and I think he's right, I quote, "It seems to have been Kant's view that if Providence," read it, teleology, "introduced the division of races, that meant that they should be retained," unquote. So here are other quotes from one anthropology lecture from 1791. You cannot find this in Akademie-Ausgabe. Should one propose that the races be fused or not, they do not fuse or melt together, and it is also not desirable that they should the whites would be degraded. For not every race adopts the morals and customs of the Europeans. And again here, all races, this is a very, very strong thesis, all historical thesis, all races will be exterminated. Americans and cannot govern themselves, so they only serve as slaves, but not those of the whites. This is again from that notorious reflection. And finally, another passage of that reflection, our history of the people goes with reliability only on the race of the whites, and then you see how broad his conception of white race is. Of course, there are ethnical hierarchies in Kant's theory. This is another topic, so we are only at the level of races. Well, these are 5 reasons they hang together, of course. I think they lay behind Kant's opposition to race mixing. First, of course, race mixing is against the purposiveness of nature. In his opposition to race mixing, Kant presupposes the transitivity of the bad. Compare this with the one-drop rule in the U.S. I'll be glad to discuss this in the or one-drop blood rule in the U.S. Third, he sees race mixing as against irreversibility thesis. Fourth, he sees similarities between race mixing and underdevelopment thesis. And not least, he thinks that race mixing is opposed to the superiority of the whites, or I would say European whites. And you could compare this with the desirability of mixing within one race, varieties within the white race. So that's it. That's my part. I would be glad for any discussion. Thanks.